Chapter 5. Founding Ethnos State. In 1947 the UN General Assembly resolved by a majority vote to establish a Jewish state, and an Arab state in the territory that had previously been known as Palestine/Eretz Israel. At that time, many thousands of displaced Jewish persons were wandering in Europe, and the small community that had been created by the Zionist settlement enterprise was supposed to take them in. The United States, which before 1924 had taken in many of the Yiddish Jews, now refused to open its gates to the broken remnants of the great Nazi massacre. So did the other rich countries. In the end, it was easier for these countries to solve the troublesome Jewish problem by offering a faraway land that was not theirs. The governments that voted for the resolution did not concern themselves with the precise meaning of the term Jew, and did not imagine what it would come to mean as the new state consolidated. At the time, the Zionist elite, which had aspired and struggled to achieve a Jewish sovereignty, would have been unable to define clearly who was a Jew and who a Gentile. Physical anthropology and, later, imported molecular genetics also failed to come up with a scientific yardstick by which to determine the origin of an individual Jew. Let us not forget that the Nazis themselves, despite their biological race doctrine, the jewel in their ideological crown, had been unable to do this, and so they ended up having to categorize Jews on the basis of bureaucratic documentation. The first important mission to be undertaken by the new state was the removal, as best it could, of those who definitely did not regard themselves as Jews. The Arab states' stubborn refusal to accept the UN's partition resolution of 1947, and their joint assault on the young Jewish state, actually helped it to consolidate. Of the approximately 900,000 Palestinians who should have remained in Israel and the additional territories it had seized in its military victory, some 730,000 fled or were expelled, more than the total number of Jews in the country at that time, 630,000. More significant for the country's future was the ideological principle that it was the historical patrimony of the Jewish people, so that the state could without compunction refuse to allow the hundreds of thousands of refugees to return to their homes and fields when the fighting was over. This partial cleansing did not entirely solve the identity problems in the new state. About 170,000 Arabs remained within its boundaries, and many of the displaced people who arrived from Europe brought their non-Jewish spouses. The 1947 UN resolution had clearly stated that the minorities remaining in both of the new states should have civil rights, and made this a condition of admitting them to the organization. Israel therefore had to grant citizenship to the Palestinians who remained. It expropriated more than half their land, and kept them under military government and harsh restrictions until 1966, but legally they were Israeli citizens. The Proclamation of Independence, the State of Israel's founding charter, reflected this ambivalence. On the one hand, it met the UN requirements regarding the state's democratic character, it promised complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants irrespective of religion, race or sex, and freedom of religion, conscience, language, education and culture. On the other hand, it would embody the Zionist vision of its founders, to implement the right of the Jewish people to national rebirth in its own country through the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. How was this ambivalent? The following pages will try to answer this question. Every large human group that thinks of itself as a people, even if it never was one and its past is entirely imaginary, has the right to national self-determination. Indeed, struggles for political independence have created more nations than nations have fought national struggles. It is well known that any attempt to deny a human group its self-determination only intensifies its demand for sovereignty and enhances its collective identity. This does not, of course, give a particular group that sees itself as a people the right to dispossess another group of its land in order to achieve its self-determination. But that is precisely what happened in mandatory Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. In 1880 there were in Palestine 25,000 Jews and 300,000 Arabs, and in 1947 there were still just 650,000 Jews and 1.3 million Palestinians. Nevertheless, the project of Zionist settlement that took in the persecuted and excluded Jews and that then became independent Israel could have devised its constitutional foundations, so that in time they would become genuinely democratic. This would have meant applying the principle of equality to all its citizens, rather than to its Jews alone. In the first chapter of this book I argued that not only is there no inherent contradiction between nationalism and democracy, but that in fact they complement each other. So far, there has been no modern democracy, that is, a state of which the sovereign is the citizenry, without there being some national or multinational framework that contains and expresses this sovereignty. The strength of the national identity derives from the consciousness that all the state's citizens are equal. It would not be wrong to say that the terms democracy and national identity usually overlap, encompassing the same historical process. The choice of the new state's name, and the ensuing debate around it, offer a glimpse into the camera obscura of Jewish rebirth. The ancient kingdom of Israel under the Omride dynasty did not, in the religious tradition, have a good reputation, and so there was some searching of the heart in regard to calling the state Israel. There were also supporters for state of Judea, to be a direct successor to the house of David and the Hasmonean kingdom, and for state of Zion, in honor of the movement that conceived it. But if the state were named Judea, then all its citizens would be called Judeans, meaning Jews, and if it were named Zion, its citizens would be called Zionists. The former would have infringed on the identity of Jewish believers throughout the world, and the Arab citizens would have become Jewish citizens with full civil rights, as Baboroshof and the young Ben Gurion had hoped long before. In the latter case, the world Zionist movement would probably have had to disband after independence, and the Arab citizens would have been classified as Zionists. There was no choice but to call the new state Israel. Ever since then, all its citizens, Jews and non-Jews alike, have been called Israelis. As we shall see, the state would not be content with the Jewish hegemony expressed by the name Israel, by its flag, its anthem and its state emblems. Because of its ethnocentric nationalist character, it would refuse to belong, formally and effectively, to all its citizens. It had been created expressly for the Jewish people, and although a major part of this ethnos has failed to implement its right to self-determination within its borders, the state has always insisted that it belongs to this ethnos. What is the Jewish ethnos? We have surveyed Jewry's possible historical origins and, beginning in the second half of the 19th century, the essentialist construction of a people out of the vestiges and memories of this variegated Jewry. But who would be included among the authorized proprietors of the Jewish state that was being re-established after 2,000 years in Israel's exclusive land? Would it be anyone who saw himself or herself as a Jew? Or any person who became an Israeli citizen? This complex issue would become one of the main pivots on which identity politics in Israel would revolve. To understand this development, we must go back to the eve of the proclamation of independence. In 1947 it had already been decided that Jews would not be able to marry non-Jews in the new state. The official reason for this civil segregation, in a society that was predominantly secular, was the unwillingness to create a secular religious split. In the famous status quo letter that David Ben Gurion, as head of the Jewish Agency, co-signed with leaders of the religious bloc, he undertook, inter alia, to leave the laws of personal status in the new state in the hands of the rabbinate. For reasons of his own, he also supported the religious camp's firm opposition to a written constitution. Ben Gurion was an experienced politician, skilled at getting what he wanted. In 1953 the political promise to bar civil marriage in Israel was given a legal basis. The law defining the legal status of the rabbinical courts determined that they would have exclusive jurisdiction over marriage and divorce of Jews in Israel. By this means, the dominant socialist Zionism harnessed the principles of the traditional rabbinate, as an alibi for its fearful imaginary that was terrified of assimilation and mixed marriage. This was the first demonstration of the state's cynical exploitation of the Jewish religion to accomplish the aims of Zionism. Many scholars who have studied the relations between religion and state in Israel have described them as Jewish nationalism submitting helplessly to the pressures applied by a powerful rabbinical camp, and its burdensome theocratic tradition. It is true there were tensions, misunderstandings and clashes between secular and religious sectors in the Zionist movement and later in the State of Israel. But a close examination reveals that nationalism needed the religious pressure, and often invited it in order to carry out its agenda. The late Professor Yeshayahu Leibovitz was more perceptive than most when he described Israel as a secular state in religious cohabitation. Given the great difficulty of defining a secular Jewish identity, and the highly uncertain boundaries of this impossible entity, it had no choice but to submit to the rabbinical tradition. It must be stated, however, that a secular Israeli culture soon began to emerge, and surprisingly fast. Although some of its features, such as festivals, holidays and symbols, derived from Jewish sources, this culture could not serve as a common foundation for the worldwide Jewish people. With its distinctive elements, from language, music and food to literature, the arts and cinema, the new culture began to demarcate a new society, quite different from what those who are known as Jews and their children experience in London, Paris, New York, and Moscow. Members of the Jewish people around the world do not speak, read or write in Hebrew, are not imprinted by Israel's urban or rural landscapes, do not experience the divisions, tragedies and joys of Israeli society, don't even know how to cheer their football teams, don't grumble about the country's income tax and don't eulogize the party leaders, who invariably let down the people of Israel. Consequently, the attitude that emerged in Zionist ideology toward the young Israeli culture was equivocal. Here was an adored infant who was not entirely legitimate, a bastard child to be cherished without looking closely at its distinctive features, which were fascinating but unprecedented in history and tradition. These modern features, which both derived from tradition and rejected it, which included elements of identity taken from both East and West and also erased them, formed a new and unfamiliar symbiosis. This secular culture is hard to define as entirely Jewish, for three main reasons. 1. The discrepancy between it and all the Jewish religious cultures, past and present, is too conspicuous. 2. The Jews of the world are not familiar with it and have no share in its rich variety and evolution. 3. Non-Jews in the State of Israel, whether Palestino-Israelis, Russian immigrants, or even foreign workers residing in it, know its nuances far better than Jews elsewhere in the world, and increasingly experience it, even while preserving their own distinctions. Zionist thinking has always been careful not to call the new Israeli society a people, much less a nation. Just as in the past it refused, in contrast to the Popular Bund Party, to define the large Yiddish population as a distinctive Eastern European people, it has refused to acknowledge the Jewish Israeli entity, which manifests the attributes of a people, or even a nation, by any criterion, language, mass culture, territory, economy, sovereignty, and so on. The specific historical character of this new people has been denied time and again by its founders and shapers. It is perceived by Zionism, as it is by Arab nationalism, as neither a people nor a nation, but as those segments of world Jewry that intend to make aliyah to, or invade, Eretz Israel, or Palestine. But the main unifying basis for international Jewry, apart from the painful memory of the Holocaust, which unfortunately grants antisemitism a permanent, if indirect, say in defining the Jew, remains the old, depleted religious culture, with the genetic demons slithering quietly behind. There has never been a secular Jewish culture common to all the Jews in the world, and the well-known argument of Rabbi Yeshayahu Karelitz, that the secular Jewish cart is empty was and remains correct. But in his traditionalist naivete, the great rabbinical scholar expected the empty secular cart to make way for the loaded religious cart. He failed to see that modern nationalism had cleverly succeeded in lightening the payload of the heavy cart and diverting it to its own destination. as in such countries as Poland, Greece and Ireland before the Second World War, or even today's Estonia and Sri Lanka, the Zionist identity contains a very distinctive blend of ethnocentric nationalism with traditional religion, where the religion becomes an instrument serving the leaders of the imaginary ethnos. Leah Greenfeld described these particular types of problematic nationalism as follows. Religion being no longer the expression of the revealed truth and interpersonal conviction, but an outward sign and symbol of their collective distinctness. What is of greater moment is that, when valued chiefly for this external, and mundane, function, religion becomes an ethnic characteristic, an ascriptive, unalterable attribute of a collectivity, and, as such, a reflection of necessity, rather than personal responsibility and choice, that is to say, in the final analysis, a reflection of race. In later years, when the socialist ethos and myth of secular Zionism sank under the financial impact of the free market, far more layers of religious paint would be needed to decorate the fictitious ethnos. But even then, toward the end of the 20th century, Israel would not become a more theocratic state. While the religious elements in the dynamics of Israeli politics have been growing stronger, so has the modernization of these very elements. They become progressively more nationalistic and hence much more racist. The lack of separation between the rabbinate and the state never reflected the real strength of the faith, whose authentic religious impulse has in fact waned over the years. The absence of separation has been a direct product of the endemic weakness of the insecure nationalism, which was forced to borrow the bulk of its imagery and symbols from the traditional religion and its texts, thereby becoming its hostage. Just as Israel was unable to decide on its territorial borders, it did not manage to draw the boundaries of its national identity. From the start it hesitated to define the membership of the Jewish ethnos. To begin with, the state appeared to accept an open definition: a Jew was any person who saw himself or herself as a Jew. In the first census, held on November 8, 1948, residents were asked to fill out a questionnaire in which they stated their nationality and religion, and these were what served as the basis for civil registration. In this way the young state managed quietly to Judaize many spouses who were not Jews. In 1950, newborn children were registered on a separate page without reference to nationality and religion, but there were two such forms, one in Hebrew and one in Arabic, and whoever filled out a Hebrew form was assumed to be a Jew. Also in 1950, Israel's parliament, the Knesset, passed the law of return. This was the first basic law that gave legal force to what the Proclamation of Independence had declared. This law declared, every Jew has the right to come to this country as an aliyah, immigrant, unless he, 1, is engaged in an activity directed against the Jewish people, or, 2, is likely to endanger public health or the security of the state. Then in 1952 came the law that granted automatic citizenship on the basis of the law of return. Beginning in the late 1940s, the world rightly viewed Israel as a refuge for the persecuted and the displaced. The systematic massacre of the Jews of Europe and the total destruction of the Yiddish-speaking people drew widespread public sympathy for the creation of a state that would be a safe haven for the remnant. In the 1950s, provoked by the Israeli-Arab conflict but also by the rise of authoritarian Arab nationalism, semi-religious, and not especially tolerant, hundreds of thousands of Arab Jews were driven from their homelands. Not all were able to reach Europe or Canada, some went to Israel, whether or not they wished to go there. The state was gratified and even sought to attract them, though it viewed with unease and contempt the diverse Arab cultures they brought with their scanty belongings. The law that granted the right of immigration to every Jewish refugee, who was subject to persecution on account of faith or origin, was quite legitimate in these circumstances. Even today such a law would not conflict with the basic principles in any liberal democracy, when many of the citizens feel kinship and a common historical destiny with people close to them who suffer discrimination in other countries. Yet the law of return was not a statute designed to make Israel a safe haven for those who were persecuted in the past, present or future because people hated them as Jews. Had the framers of this law wished to do so, they could have placed it on a platform of humanist principle, linking the privilege of asylum to the existence and threat of anti-Semitism. But the law of return and the associated law of citizenship were direct products of an ethnic nationalist worldview, designed to provide a legal basis for the concept that the State of Israel belongs to the Jews of the world. As Ben-Gurion declared at the start of the parliamentary debate on the law of return, this is not a Jewish state only because most of its inhabitants are Jews. It is a state for the Jews wherever they may be, and for any Jew who wishes to be here. Anyone who was included in the Jewish people, including such notables as Pierre Mendès France, the French Prime Minister in the early 1950s, Bruno Kreisky, the Austrian Chancellor in the 1970s, Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State at that time, or Joe Lieberman, the Democratic candidate for Vice President of the United States in 2000, was a potential citizen of the Jewish state, and their right to settle there was guaranteed by the law of return. A member of the Jewish nation might be a full citizen with equal rights in some liberal national democracy, might even be the holder of an elected position in it, but Zionist principle held that such a person was destined, or even obliged, to migrate to Israel and become its citizen. Moreover, immigrants could leave Israel immediately after arrival, yet keep their Israeli citizenship for the rest of their lives. This privilege, which was not extended even to close family members of non-Jewish Israeli citizens, should have included a clear definition of who was truly qualified to enjoy it. But neither the law of return nor the law of citizenship, which ensured the continued official status of the Zionist Federation and the Jewish National Fund in Israel, further consolidating Israel as the state of world Jewry, includes such a definition. The question hardly came up during the first decade of the state's existence. The society that was taking shape and tripling its population was engaged in creating a common cultural foundation for the masses of immigrants, and the really urgent question was, how does one become an Israeli? The political failure and the forced withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula in 1956 cooled the overheated atmosphere that prevailed after the military victory in the Suez War. In March 1958, during this calmer period in the national mood, Minister of the Interior Israel Bar Yehuda, a faithful representative of the Zionist left, as a leader of Ardent Havoda, instructed his office that a person declaring sincerely that he is a Jew will be registered as a Jew, and no further proof will be required. The representatives of the national religious camp were predictably furious. The astute Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, knowing full well that it would be impossible in an immigrant state to determine on a purely voluntary basis who was a Jew, soon overturned the secular gesture of his Minister of the Interior, and ambiguous order was restored. The Ministry of the Interior was then handed to the Orthodox camp, which went back to registering people as Jews on the basis of their mother's identity. The nature of Jewish nationalism, enshrined in the laws of the state, was cast into sharp focus 4 years later. In 1962 Shemuel Oswald Rufeisen, known as Brother Daniel, petitioned the High Court of Justice, the Supreme Court, to instruct the state to recognize him as a Jew by nationality. Rufeisen was born to a Jewish family in Poland in 1922, and as a teenager joined a Zionist youth movement. He fought as a partisan against the Nazi occupation and saved the lives of many Jews. At some point he hid in a monastery, where he converted to Christianity. After the war he studied for the priesthood, and in order to go to Israel he became a Carmelite monk. In 1958 he went to Israel because he wished to take part in the Jewish destiny and still saw himself as a Zionist. Having given up his Polish citizenship, he applied to become an Israeli citizen on the basis of the law of return, arguing that although he was a Catholic by religion, he was still a Jew by nationality. When his application was rejected by the Ministry of the Interior, he petitioned the High Court of Justice. By a 4-1 decision, the court rejected his petition to be given Israeli citizenship on the basis of the law of return. He was, however, granted an Israeli identity card, which stated, nationality, not clear. Ultimately, Brother Daniel's betrayal of Judaism by joining the religion of the Nazarene overcame the deterministic biological imaginary. It was categorically decided that there was no Jewish nationality without its religious shell. Ethnocentric Zionism needed the halakhic precepts as its principal criteria, and the secular judges understood this national historical necessity very well. Another effect that this decision had on the concept of identity in Israel was to deny the right of the individual to declare himself a Jew. Now, only the sovereign judicial authority could determine the nationality of a citizen living in his own country. Another important test case for the definition of a Jew took place toward the end of the decade. In 1968, Major Binyamin Shalit petitioned the High Court of Justice to order the Minister of the Interior to register his two sons as Jews. Unlike Brother Daniel, the mother of these boys was not a born Jew but a Scottish Gentile. Shalit, a well-regarded officer in Israel's victorious army, argued that his sons were growing up as Jews and wished to be considered full citizens in the state of the Jewish people. By what seemed a miracle, 5 of the 9 judges who heard the petition decided that the boys were Jewish by nationality, if not by religion. But this exceptional decision shook the entire political structure. This was after the Six-Day War of 1967, when Israel had captured a large non-Jewish population, and the opposition to mingling with Gentiles had actually grown more rigid. In 1970, under pressure from the religious camp, the law of return was amended to include, finally, a full and exact definition of who is an authentic member of the people of Israel. A Jew is one who was born to a Jewish mother, or converted to Judaism, and does not belong to another religion. After 22 years of hesitation and questioning, the instrumental link between the rabbinical religion and the essentialist nationalism was now well and truly welded. Needless to say, many secular supporters of nationalism would have preferred more flexible or scientific criteria by which to define Jews, for example, accepting cases where the father was a Jew, or finding some genetic marker to reveal a person's Jewishness. But in the absence of looser criteria or a reliable scientific one, the Jewish Israeli majority resigned itself to the halakhic verdict. To them, the rigid tradition was preferable to a serious blurring of the Jewish distinction, and to turning Israel into a mere liberal democracy belonging to all its citizens. Not all Israelis, of course, accepted the strict definition of their Jewishness. After the amendment to the law of return, one person petitioned to change the nationality stated on his identity card from Jewish to Israeli. Georg Raphael Tamarin was a lecturer in education at Tel Aviv University. He had come to Israel from Yugoslavia in 1949, and declared himself to be a Jew. In the early 1970s he applied to have his nationality changed from Jewish to Israeli for 2 reasons: 1, that the new criterion for defining a Jew had become, in his opinion, a racial religious one, and 2, that the establishment of the State of Israel had created an Israeli nationality, to which he felt he belonged. His petition was rejected by a unanimous vote. The judges decided that he had to remain a Jew by nationality, as an Israeli nationality did not exist. Curiously, the President of the Supreme Court, Justice Shimon Agranet, Israel Prize laureate, did not simply base his decision on the proclamation of independence. He also proceeded to explain why there was a Jewish nation but absolutely not an Israeli one. Agranet's conceptualization of nationhood and nationality was inconsistent, as it rested entirely on subjective aspects yet refused to allow individual choice, and it reflected the dominant ideology in Israel. He cited as proof of the existence of a Jewish nation the emotion and tears of the Israeli paratroopers who captured the Western Wall, thus showing himself influenced more by journalistic stories than by books of history and political philosophy, though this did not prevent him from flaunting his scholarship throughout the written decision. Despite the narrow definition of the Jew in the law of return, the state's pragmatic needs were too strong to exclude other white immigrants. Following a wave of anti-Semitism in Poland in 1968, many of the families who emigrated from there had one non-Jewish partner. In the second half of the 20th century, both in the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc and in the liberal democratic countries. There were numerous mixed marriages, which promoted assimilation in the various national cultures. This phenomenon led Golda Meir, Israel's truculent prime minister, to declare that a Jew who married a Gentile was in effect joining the 6 million victims of the Nazis. This grave situation forced the lawmakers to balance the narrow definition of the Jew by widening significantly the right of aliyah, immigration to Israel. Clause 4a was added to the law of return. Dubbed the Grandchild Clause, it enabled not only Jews but also their non-Jewish children, grandchildren and spouses to immigrate to Israel. It was enough for one grandparent to qualify as a Jew for the offspring to become citizens of Israel. This important clause would later open the door to the huge influx of immigrants that began in the early 1990s, with the fall of communism. This immigration, which had no ideological dimension, Israel had begun in the 1980s to urge the United States not to accept Soviet Jewish refugees, meant that more than 30% of the newcomers could not be registered as Jews on their identity cards. While nearly 300,000 new immigrants were not classified as members of the Jewish people, an assimilatory time bomb, as the Israeli press described it, this did not prevent the continued intensification of ethnocentric identity, an intensification that had begun in the late 1970s. Paradoxically, the rise of the Likud Party, led by Menahem Begin, strengthened two processes that had been evident in Israel's political culture for some time: liberalization and ethnicization. The decline of Zionist socialism, whose Eastern European origins had not been especially tolerant or pluralistic, and the corning to power of a popular right-wing party, disliked by most Israeli intellectuals, gave greater legitimacy to political and cultural confrontation. Israel became accustomed to periodic power changes, such as it had not known during the first 30 years of its existence. The tradition of protest and criticism also changed. The first war in Lebanon showed that it was possible to attack the government even while battles raged, and yet not to be denounced as a traitor. At the same time, the gradual shrinking of the socialist Zionist welfare state, and the rise of economic neoliberalism loosened somewhat the constraints of the state supra-identity. When the omnipotent national state became a limited liability institution, alternative sub-identities, especially ethnic and communal ones, grew stronger. This was a global process, not confined to Israel, and will be discussed further. Though Israeli culture continued to develop and flourish during the first 20 years of power over the territories seized in 1967, 2 decades that passed fairly quietly, prospects for the consolidation of an Israeli civil identity were weakened. The policy of massive settlement in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was conducted in an undisguisedly apartheid manner, while encouraging its citizens to settle in the occupied territories. Israel did not legally annex most of them, so as to avoid being responsible for the local inhabitants. This led to the creation of a state-subsidized master's democracy in the new spaces, reinforcing a lordly ethnocentric consciousness even in Israel's relatively democratic circles. Another factor that heightened the exclusionary essentialist tendency in the Jewish population, especially in its tradition-minded and socio-economically weaker sectors, was the eruption into the public arena and audiovisual media of Palestino-Israeli figures of a new kind, who dared to claim their right to an equal share in the joint homeland. Fear of losing the Zionist privileges that had been granted because of the Jewish nature of the state exacerbated a selfish ethnic exclusivity among the masses, especially the Eastern Jews or Russian Jews, who had not been sufficiently acculturated by Israel and hence were economically unrewarded. These groups felt especially threatened by the growing demands for equality coming from representatives of the Arab population.